This is the second general session of our Fourth International Convention. So we'll open it by joining in God Save the Queen. Be seated, please. To officially open this session, we're going to ask a girl who is much beloved in Toronto, I guess in all of Ontario, I wouldn't be surprised in all of Canada, Marg M.
Ladies and gentlemen, in the custom of the tradition of the AA world in opening all our meetings, we are going to have a moment's silence followed by the Serenity Prayer. Each of us will have our own thoughts in this moment of silence. But I would ask of you, nay, I would beg of you, to include in your own thoughts during that moment a very fervent prayer for the millions who still do not know and are yet to come to the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. May we have that moment now, please. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.
I should make a very simple announcement that these mics, these head receivers that we're using back here, tune us in, not out of Maple Leaf Gardens. Last night, everyone on the stage was tuned out. By way of introduction, my name is Herb, and I'm an alcoholic. Hi! Ever since I came into AA, I've tried to keep it simple, and look where I am now. Good. Before AA, I'd assembled around me enough complications to last me a lifetime, and these I shed, or thought I shed, when I joined the club. I do like to keep my AA simple. I like to think of it as just one drunk talking to another, because we know that is the essence of AA, and we've seen that working here for the past 2 days. We've had meetings which were very big in size, but no one of them was further away from the problems of one alcoholic than the voice of another alcoholic ready to help. I like to keep my AA simple, and I think that so do all those who find themselves involved in the affairs of groups or central offices or area committees or the General Service Office. But because AA may well be what the humorists sometimes label it, that is a simple program for complicated people, we find that the custodians or the trusted servants are kept pretty busy at times trying to uncomplicate things. Because some overzealous AA may be drawing the movement into matters that lead to trouble and may hurt AA in many ways. They may give the world a cockeyed picture of the AA program, or they may create violent disunity that may end up splitting groups and even splitting cities into factions. Now, we all know that AA thrives on argument and on our freely expressed interpretation of just about every phase of the recovery program. But we also know that along with this, our unity of purpose is vital to AA's future, if there is always to be an opportunity for one drunk to talk to another drunk. Our fellowship has come a long way in helping the sick alcoholic to recover. And in all those years since the beginning, it has added no trappings to the single basic AA program. Alcoholics arrive at our meeting places today with the same problems of money and marriage or marriages and muddle-headedness that we had when we first came in. And we offer them the same simply stated program contained in the 12 steps. All this has gone on unchanged for 30 years because many people have worked hard to keep it that way. Not by the exercise of any authority, because there is no such thing in AA, but by the exchange of experiences, wherein history has pointed the way to our strength and growth today. It is clear that the simplicity that makes our program unique, and AA certainly a unique society, is a result of no accident. Bill and all those who worked with him through the creation of the 12 steps and later the 12 traditions knew exactly what they were doing. They recognized the fact that AA should stick to what it found it could do so miraculously, the sobering up of drunks who are willing to embrace the 12 steps. In the years that bring us up to this moment in our history, AA has grown from a handful of groups to more than 12,000. Along with this has been the growth of central service offices, the development of a vital conference structure, and the expansion of your general service office. In all this time, the authority of AA has not changed. It is simply and beautifully expressed in the tradition, which we all know, for our group purpose, there is but one ultimate authority, a loving God as he may express himself in our group conscience. Our leaders are but trusted servants, they do not govern. It is this right of group conscience that our trusted servants work to ensure for the future, so that there will always be the opportunity for the drunk who needs help to hear the voice of another drunk speaking the language of recovery. The keynote of this convention, this fourth international convention, is responsibility. And I'd like to take you back 2 years to a time when we were first discussing a theme for Toronto. Seems like 10 years, but it was 2 years. All agreed that our beloved fellowship had, in its 30 years of growth, developed a fine sense of responsibility. Individually, we had taken on an acceptance of personal and social responsibility that was once alien to our lives. We felt responsible for getting the message to the still unreconstructed drunk. We even felt responsible for the quality of our own sobriety. So far in our discussion, all agreed and it was smooth sailing. Then we tried to whip these thoughts into a slogan that would speak for all AAs. Silly idea. Could we say, for example, AA is responsible for thus and so? Or could we say, for example, every AA carries the responsibility of the 12 steps? And here we bogged down badly. It all sounded very preachy. It didn't sound like AA at all. Why? Because we discovered when I apply the word responsibility to you, I'm actually starting to take your inventory, or at least it sounds that way. Then responsibility becomes an unpleasant word like duty or taxes or work. And this brought home to us that in AA, at least, individual responsibility is a personal thing. My saying that I am responsible is fine. My saying you are responsible is something else again. So we hope that what you find on the backs of your programs, we hope that paragraph expresses how each one of us feels personally and how we all feel collectively as individuals making up the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, in the workshops that we attended yesterday and today, and in the special panel meetings, and yes, in the many alcothons we've been to, we heard this idea of responsibility expressed in many ways, in approval of what AA is doing, and sometimes in criticism of what we might be doing and are not. Now, our first speaker tonight, Bernard Smith, has been one of our most constructive critics, and along with it, a most dependable pilot in helping us steer a safe and favorable course through AA's many responsibilities as a movement. Bern is a man who understands the enthusiasms and devotion which frequently have drawn the movement toward a risky course. He understands, too, that alertness and awareness of needs are essential to AA's bright future. Bern understands us because he loves us. And he loves the fellowship, although he is what we smugly call a non-AA, as though the world were divided into two parts, one part inhabited by AAs and the other by non-AAs. But Bern loves us notwithstanding, and he has demonstrated that devotion in many ways since he became a trustee back in 1944. Since then, and particularly during his 5 years as chairman of the General Service Board, he has been an important architect of AA structure. A word about Bern: he's a great lawyer. He's of international renown, although he's a modest man and denies this. And only today did I discover that he is a commander of the Order of the British Empire. And he has given to us freely of all his talents. He's given to us freely of all his talents, working hand in hand with Bill in the development of a conference structure that has served us so well. Bern wrote the conference charter, which will last AA far into the future. He wrote the bylaws of the board that are a masterpiece, incorporating as they do the 12 steps and the 12 traditions in a very sound legal document. And this, you'll agree, is no mean feat. But then, Bern is no average person. We will hear from Bernard Smith.
I've been asked to talk to you this evening of my long years of service as a non-alcoholic trustee, as I saw AA grow, and of the significance of this growth within AA and upon all human society. Yes, AA has grown in the 21 years since I first became a trustee. It has grown in traditions, in numbers, in organization, and in public acceptance. But in a larger sense, it has not grown at all. Simply stated, what has been happening is that the miracle that took place at a kitchen in Akron, Ohio, 30 years ago, when one alcoholic who had ceased to drink first reached out his hand to his brother alcoholic who was still drinking, has been repeated hundreds of thousands of times. And as long as the hand of man reaches out to clasp the hand of his suffering brother, the miracle that took place in a kitchen in Akron will be repeated over and over and over again. But as the membership of Alcoholics Anonymous rapidly grew in numbers, it became increasingly clear that Alcoholics Anonymous must not be permitted to remain anarchic. It had to be insulated from the human drive for power and gain, from all the materialistic traps with which the jungle of human society is set. AA needed traditions. It needed a charter. It needed a general service conference. It needed a structural fabric stout enough to protect its precious content, not so much to preserve the sobriety of those who had already found it in AA, but for those who still staggered in the shadows, who did not yet know what can be done for them and what they can do for themselves. Of equal importance, we had to ensure that this great society of yours would be so securely structured that for as far as we could look in the future, it would be a haven of hope for the generations of alcoholics yet unborn, so that we, so far as our human resources were equal to the task, could ensure that this God-given grant of life, which AA has provided you, is not lost to those who will need it in time to come. But let me recall for you my initial exposure to Alcoholics Anonymous. One late afternoon, some 21 years ago, 3 men came to my law office in New York to ask me to form a corporation to be known as the Alcoholic Foundation. One of these men was a tall, gangling, beardless, Lincoln-esque figure wearing a crumpled suit who was introduced to me as Bill Wilson. I didn't know then precisely what attracted me to Bill, but I felt intuitively I would like to know this man. So as the meeting drew to a close, I asked Bill to take dinner with me that evening. And so we dined together, and at first, in lawyer-like fashion, I proceeded to interrogate Bill on what there was about Alcoholics Anonymous that brought sobriety to the alcoholic. I learned from him that evening why an alcoholic who had ceased to drink could help another who was still drinking. I learned that it was not through science or through the use of psychic energizers or tranquilizers that Alcoholics Anonymous was arresting the disease of alcoholism, but rather through the use of the ageless precepts of humility, of honesty, of devotion and love, that AA was beginning to succeed where all other efforts to resolve the problem of alcoholism had failed. I talked to Bill that evening of alcoholics I had known, whose spiritual reservoirs had not yet been emptied, who might have lived had the message of Alcoholics Anonymous been delivered to them as it was then being delivered to others. I recall telling him how deeply I regretted that AA had not come into existence a decade earlier, so that fine, sensitive men I had known and who had died might have lived. I remember telling him of a man I knew, a great artist and an alcoholic, who had received a commission to do a huge mural in an office building in New York City. It had been arranged that until the job was completed, he should be given just a few dollars at a time just to keep him going. When this mural was about 3/4 finished, this alcoholic artist approached one of the owners who did not know of this arrangement and secured from him a few $100s on account. He received it. You all know how he used it. He never survived to finish that mural. Efforts were made to find someone who could complete it, but no one could be found who could completely capture his inspiration and artistry. And so, until this building was torn down not so long ago, that mural remained, 3/4 of it, a monument to a supreme artist and the other quarter blank space, the tombstone of an alcoholic. I told Bill then of my fruitless efforts to help some of my alcoholic friends. For some of them I had designed a plan which has since been used in AA called nickel therapy. For I asked them to telephone me when they felt like drinking. They did, but only when they couldn't find anyone else to serve as a drinking companion. I learned from Bill that evening why my feeble efforts failed. For rarely, if ever, can the non-alcoholic help the alcoholic. I knew as Bill talked to me that evening that something tremendously significant was taking form in human society. Indeed, it was one of the most stimulating evenings of my life. And so, as asked, I proceeded to form the Alcoholic Foundation as a corporation, and not long thereafter began my 21-year service as a trustee. During the years that immediately followed, we on the Board of Trustees of the Alcoholic Foundation debated each of the traditions that Bill proposed that were ultimately to take form as your 12 traditions. This was a time when the name Alcoholics Anonymous was being used by many people both in and out of AA to serve their own purposes. It was a time when many who had not completely absorbed the spiritual precepts of the 12 steps were disregarding anonymity. It was a time when many were thinking of tapping the outside world for contributions to Alcoholics Anonymous. We had too little money even then to open a Seamen's Club in New York that was desperately needed. We had to have handouts from the better-heeled trustees. And so we non-alcoholic trustees had great difficulty at first in going along with Bill when he proposed the 7th tradition, namely that AA must decline outside contributions. Bill had to hammer home to us meeting after meeting the reasons why AA must be self-supporting and why it must not accept financial help from the non-alcoholic world. And this, mind you, was at a time when Bill and Lois were leading an incredibly meager existence. And we on the board would have liked to have had more money then, among other reasons, to help them live a more gracious life. But Bill persisted, and so that tradition, like the others, with which you are familiar, finally took form. I must confess that during the years I served as chairman, I had moments of monetary hesitation. When obliged to give effect to this tradition, I had to sign letters declining legacies and gifts. But you must remember, I am not an alcoholic. Once the 12 traditions were adopted, Bill came to us with a plan to establish a general service conference to meet annually with delegates chosen from each state of the Union and from the provinces of Canada. At first, this appeared to be a revolutionary and indeed unpalatable concept, for the Board of Trustees had become accustomed to enjoying the proprietary right to serve, and the idea of a conference at which this board would have to account to the collective conscience of AA and in effect seek its guidance was not initially greeted with great enthusiasm. For we non-alcoholic trustees were really removed from the broad body of experience of AA. On the whole, we learned about AA only through that which the alcoholic trustees told us. And some of them, and some of our non-alcoholic trustees, could not at first recognize that the concept of the General Service Conference was another step essential for the preservation of Alcoholics Anonymous, not only for our time, but so far as possible, for all time. I felt strongly that this General Service Conference must take form, for I regarded it as vital to create within AA a strength and flexibility so constructed that its spiritual principles for recovery would be forever insulated from the fallibility of man, and that all fundamental changes affecting AA should be decided and determined not by a handful of men serving as trustees of the Alcoholic Foundation, but decided in unity with the collective conscience of AA itself. As the years passed, views began to change, and in time a vote was taken, and by a majority of 1, it was decided that such a conference as Bill had envisioned should take form. But this was much too narrow a margin for comfort, and so the concept of a conference was tabled. It was only when the resolution for the holding of the conference was adopted by an overwhelming majority with only 2 dissenting votes that the General Service Conference began to take form. And I would suggest that it was through our persistence in requiring that most of the trustees support the concept of a conference before it would take place that another approach to basic traditions and policies within AA was born. And this is the principle that has uniformly since been followed, namely that we must obtain an overwhelming majority of approval within AA before any basic change in the traditions or policies of LAA should be permitted to take place. Shortly before the first General Service Conference was convened, and at a meeting of the board from which I was absent, I was elected chairman of the Alcoholic Foundation and asked to serve as chairman of the General Service Conferences during the period that I would continue to serve as chairman of the foundation. The 6 years in which I served as your chairman were formative years in AA. They were exhilarating years and rich years for me. But there were years in which I found myself devoting a sizable portion of my time to AA, for I now had a responsibility to a society that I personally regarded as the greatest spiritual phenomenon of our century. And to the best of such ability as I had, I tried to meet that responsibility. Not long after I became chairman, I journeyed with Bill to attend the American Health Conference at San Francisco to accept the Alaska Award in behalf of Alcoholics Anonymous. This was one privilege I was going to get because I didn't have to have anonymity. It is significant to remember, however, that this award was given not primarily because of our success in dealing with the disease of alcoholism, but because of the success of Alcoholics Anonymous as an experiment in social pioneering. Before we accepted this award in behalf of AA at the San Francisco Opera House, Bill and I met with the press. The press crowded around Bill as a founder of Alcoholics Anonymous and paid scant attention to me. Personally, I think most of them thought I was there as Bill's bodyguard. But you have to always remember, and I try to remember it occasionally, and there are times one might wonder, I am not an alcoholic. And I had yet to learn, if I ever shall, the true meaning of humility. At any rate, Bill, noticing my distress, finally called the attention of the press to the fact that I was the non-alcoholic chairman of AA. And then the press took interest in me, for the idea of a non-alcoholic chairman of AA could be newsworthy. So they came to me, talked to me as though I was a Siamese twin, or in any event, something in the nature of a circus freak. I remember being asked what were my qualifications for serving as a non-alcoholic chairman of the of an alcoholic society. And you must remember at this particular moment in time, if I was lacking in anything, it was humility. So in my annoyance, I told them, and I think this is quite true, that my attributes were quite simple. I should drink enough every day to be sympathetic with the problem of the alcoholic without becoming one. I must be able to carry my liquor without necessarily being carried out. I'm entitled to an occasional hangover, but mustn't put any of them back to back. But let me go back to the Lasker Award. The award which we accepted on behalf of AA was given, as I said, for social pioneering, the hope that AA brings to a sick society. And I said at that time at the Opera House in San Francisco that you who are sick were now well. Well, not in the sense that you who once drank too much now did not drink at all, but well in the sense that you had found a spiritual way to live in a materialistic world instead of surrendering to it. Now, prior to the second conference, the trustees of the Alcoholic Foundation had decided that this corporate name was a misnomer, for the word foundation had a connotation of a society that sought outside contributions rather than one that declined them. So we agreed to present to the next General Service Conference the name Alcoholics Anonymous International as the name to which the Alcoholic Foundation should be changed. In those early years, the conference delegates still had a measure of respect for the Board of Trustees, and so when I, as chairman of the General Service Conference, presented that name for approval, 90% of the delegates approved the change of name. However, it was then, and continued to be my practice as chairman of the General Service Conference, to give everyone who had any view to express the opportunity to present that view. And some very persuasive arguments were made disapproving of this name. And so, despite a 90% vote in favor of the change of name, I asked for a vote to table the motion until the succeeding year, a motion that was then adopted. Within the next year, Bill came forward with our present name, the General Service Board of Alcoholics Anonymous. That was a name that fully expressed the true functions of the Board of Trustees. It did require a kind of humility on the part of the non-alcoholic trustees to accept the concept that they were trustees to serve the alcoholics rather than to direct the policies of its society. Alcoholics Anonymous International was a prideful name. The name General Service Board of Alcoholics Anonymous was a humble one. Came then the need for a charter under which for all time, all power and all responsibility would be vested in the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. Bill was both the inspiration and the architect of that charter. A few of us made minor contributions, but basically, the inspiration for the charter and its architect, as that for the 12 steps, the 12 traditions of the conference, belongs to Bill. At the 1955 conference, the year of the third legacy, the charter was adopted. There was but one minor task left to be done before the basic structure of Alcoholics Anonymous could be regarded as complete, at least for the time being. That was the preparation of a new set of bylaws for the General Service Board of Alcoholics Anonymous that would integrate the 12 steps, the 12 traditions, and the charter with a set of legal bylaws. This task I undertook to do, and so I prepared them. And I would only suggest that anyone would read them, would understand what can happen to a non-alcoholic when exposed to such a spiritually based society as AA and given the responsibility of serving it. After the 1955 conference, I was beginning to have an intuitive feeling that the time had come for me to step down as chairman, for it was my view that within AA, no man other than a founder has a proprietary right to serve. I thought of the frailties of the human mind, and I began to concern myself lest at some future time, distant I hope, but never to happen, a man might become chairman who, driven by great personal ambition, perhaps even unthinkingly, might attempt to divert the spiritual base of AA out of a sheer instinctive drive for power. After much reflection, I came to the conclusion that I, as the first chairman to serve since the General Service Conference took form, should now resign. My fellow trustees and my many friends in AA urged strongly that I refrain from so doing. I had lived, however, too closely, been too long identified with structuring Alcoholics Anonymous to ensure its future not to make the decision I did was, as that first chairman, to help establish the tradition that no man in this society of yours should ever feel he has a proprietary right to serve. And so, while continuing as a trustee, I resigned the chairmanship. In the years which followed, I often thought, what would have happened if the spiritual message that Bill delivered to Dr. Bob in Akron, Ohio, had not reached this earth 30 years ago? As I think of the 10,000-odd people gathered here before me this evening, I cannot help thinking, what if delivery of the inspired message had been delayed for another 50 years? If any of us at this evening are wanting in humility, that thought alone should give it to us. But let us not suppose, for it did come to us within our time. Why did it come in our time? We know not. But it did come at a time when our world was becoming increasingly directed toward materialistic purposes, when man's wants, his needs, his ambitions were being steadily oriented toward material goals. Yes, you in AA today have a responsibility, for its message of hope for you and for all other alcoholics came in your time. It was not delayed until the next generation or the one after that. And so our collective responsibility goes beyond our own time. For that which brought you your recovery was not created by you, but for you. And with the humility that must forever pervade AA, the message you received and which brought with it your recovery must ever be available to others now and to those who in time to come will find rebirth in AA. Not so long ago, a great British scientist said that the pace of modern civilization was producing mass stress. He saw this as accentuated by, and I quote, the essentially unsatisfying, aimless, and materialist outlook of modern life. Within our own lifetime, we have seen the first dictionary definition of happiness, now defined as good luck, good fortune, prosperity, a totally materialistic definition. And as you are all aware, changes in dictionary definitions mirror man's ever-changing ideals and desires. And so, never let us forget that you have found a spiritual base for living in a materialistic world. And in making AA work, you are demonstrating to all who dwell in this world that a spiritually based society can survive, and that men and women living by its tenets can function effectively and decently despite the competitive, automated, conforming character of modern society. How can you convey to all of human society that it is not through the advances in science in a new age that man may find fulfillment, but rather through the timeless precepts of humility, devotion, love, and respect for our fellow men? How can you convey these simple truths, to quote Herb, the other world, the non-alcoholic world, to those of us who do not have a discarded bottle to serve as a yardstick of spiritual recovery? How deeply must much of the rest of mankind suffer before they too can discover that the precept, or rather the practice of these ageless precepts which brought your recovery, can transform the aimlessness of their lives? You can do this best, in my view, by consistently giving effect to the 12th step of AA, which in essence is simply a pragmatic approach to the fundamental base of all faiths in the words, love thy neighbor as thyself. The non-alcoholic in our society does not generally find, nor often seeks, a neighborhood within which to practice this concept. Most of us non-alcoholics assuage our guilt feelings, if we have them, on the neighbor concept by financial contributions to a community fund, nor often seeks a neighborhood within which to practice this concept. Most of us non-alcoholics assuage our guilt feelings, if we have them, on the neighbor concept by financial contributions to a community fund or to other recognized charities. We do not enjoy the advantage that you have of seeing that neighbor, of directly helping him, of experiencing the inner glow that inevitably must accompany your restoring to the light of AA one who, as an alcoholic, has lived in darkness and despair. You in AA do something very specific and direct in helping your alcoholic neighbors. You have staked out a definitive neighborhood, and that neighborhood is one of those human beings in every place, in every country where men and women still suffer from the disease of alcoholism. Having staked out that neighborhood, and through the direct application of the 12th step, you can devote your time, your thoughts, your energies to bring this message of life as you know it to these alcoholic neighbors who suffer as you once did. You show them how to function in this modern age, restoring them to faith, to useful lives, and to the joy and fulfillment of becoming a part of a great spiritual fellowship. And as the world sees you grow in numbers, man may in time perhaps follow your way of being liberated from the unsatisfying drives which now consume him. And just remember, the miracle of the recovery of each alcoholic is observed by all of his relatives and friends, and to them it is as great a miracle as it is to the recovered alcoholic. So that each alcoholic you reach means that perhaps 20 to 100 non-alcoholics are directly or indirectly exposed to the wonders of AA, and in that way, too, you are making a contribution to those who have not suffered from the disease of alcoholism. Science, indeed, may provide palliatives for a sick society, but it cannot provide cures. And you in AA cannot directly provide this cure for us. You can only demonstrate that it exists. And by your unceasing devotion to the principles and traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous, show by your example that these timeless precepts of humility, honesty, devotion, and love, which are the heart of your 12 steps, can serve as a means of shattering the materialistic chains in which so much of our non-alcoholic world now finds itself ensnared. We in Alcoholics Anonymous applaud the efforts of science to discover a biochemical cure for alcoholism, and we hope in time this cure may come. For Alcoholics Anonymous claims no monopoly in arresting the disease of alcoholism. What it does claim is that it has found a simple spiritual way of life, that in arresting the disease of alcoholism serves to make man a better, happier, and finer human being. And because this is important not only to you, but to all human society, I know you will do all within your power to ensure that Alcoholics Anonymous, as a spiritually based society, continues to grow in numbers and in dedication. I say to you, in the language of our time, you have something great and awesome going for you. Treat it tenderly. Respect what it has done for you and what it can do for others. Too many men and women, alienated from themselves and others, are staggering and cowering in the darkness tonight in this fair land, unknowingly waiting for your helping hand. Do not deny them. Keep the spiritual society of yours strong, supple, and humble, so that it may serve future generations as it has served your own. For as long as the grape grows on the vine and the grain in the field, men will ferment them. Help Alcoholics Anonymous grow in numbers so that the non-alcoholic world may become increasingly aware that there is a way of life based on simple truths that lead to happiness, not as the dictionary now defines it, but as you in Alcoholics Anonymous live it. And as long as one man dwells in the darkness you once knew, you cannot rest. You must find him, and in finding and helping him become one of you, you will ever experience the joy of giving, the joy of self-fulfillment, the joy of sharing in the building of an edifice spiritually dedicated, reaching high into the heavens, and by the grace of God, may it last for all time. And so as you carry the message of AA to other alcoholics, you are carrying it as well to all mankind, a message which may be simply stated in the words of the Bible: Thou shalt not harden thy heart, nor shut thy hand from thy poor brother. Thank you, my friends, for letting me join you this evening.
Dear friends, with true magnificence and superb clarity,
Byrne has been portraying the realities of our responsibility to the future. And he has been restating to us those eternal verities that gather around love, which are the substance of our aspirations. In effect, he has said, without humility, there can be no genuine responsibility. And lacking humility and responsibility, there can be no outgoing love freely given. So it is well that together here in this World Convention, we have been pondering the subject of our future responsibilities. Since these cover a rather wide range, I think that my comments upon them, upon responsibilities partly or only unfulfilled, could be best packaged up for you were I to paraphrase an article recently done which some of you have seen in the grapevine. So, as a starter, dear folks, here goes. In AA's 30th year, responsibility is our theme, so it was titled. On the occasion of this, our 30th anniversary, it is ever so fitting that our keynote is AA responsibility. All of us have been thinking of those 3 decades of AA life that are now history. Stirred by gratitude quite beyond expression, we here give thanks to God, whose grace has made it possible for us to achieve that quality of responsibility which has brought our fellowship into its present state of well-being and worldwide reach. As you and I look back over the years, we are quite unable to conceive of more than a mere fraction of what God has wrought among us. None of us can imagine the awful sum of the suffering that was once ours, nor the aggregate of the misery that has been the lot of those near and dear. Then, too, who can begin to understand the mysterious nature of our transforming spiritual experiences, those gifts of God that have opened to us of AA a new world of being and doing and living. Indeed, our blessings have been quite beyond any human comprehension. Here at Toronto, we see countless new faces. Many from distant tongues are heard, from distant lands are heard to speak in other tongues. We are dramatically reminded that the sun never sets upon this fellowship, that 350,000 of us have recovered from our malady, that we have everywhere begun to transcend all those once formidable barriers of race, creed, and nationality. This new assurance that so many of us have been able to meet our responsibility for sobriety, for growth, and for effectiveness in the troubled world where we live, has filled us with the deepest satisfaction and joy. Yet, as a people who have always learned the hard way, we certainly do not congratulate ourselves. Instead, we perceive all these new assets to be God's gifts, which have only in part been matched by an increased willingness on our part to find and to do His will for us. Then, too, we have well recalled how the painful desolation of our illness actually drove us to what was our first responsible decision, our first responsible act in years, that of joining AA. We remember how alcoholism had lashed us to such a point of collapse that we became willing to do whatever was necessary to get well. For indeed, it was a matter of life or death. Thus, goading on, we finally did join the fellowship. And there we had our first glimpse of its quite new world of understanding and loving concern. Presently, we took a look at AA's 12 steps for recovery. Yet it must be admitted that some of these, us, promptly forgot 10 of them as possibly not needed. At first, we bought only the concepts that we were alcoholics, that attendance at meetings and a helping hand to the newcomers would be sufficient to solve our booze problem, and no doubt all problems. Indeed, some of us began to look with approval on that insidious old cliche which says that drinking is but a good man's fault. Once off the grog, life should become, we thought, as pleasant as a bowl of cherries. So at first, we simply warmed our hands at the AA fire, and all seemed well. Then, by slow degrees, certain dissatisfaction set in. Perhaps our own group was not so wonderful as we had first supposed. Maybe there was some rock throwing at a scandal, or perhaps a distressing row. Who would become the group's next chairman? Then, too, we found that there were people we simply could not like. And worse yet, the ones we did admire often failed to give us the attention that we really deserved. Even back at home, we were apt to get a shock. Once the pink cloud had passed over the household, things sometimes seemed just as bad as ever. The old wounds simply wouldn't heal at all. Though visibly impressed with our sobriety, the bank nevertheless demanded to know when we were going to pay up. Our boss likewise requested in firm tones that we get with it. At this point, each of us looked up his sponsor and regaled him with these unexpected woes. Those various resentments, anxieties, and depressions were definitely caused, we claim, either by our unfortunate circumstances or by the inconsiderate behavior of other people. Greatly to our consternation, our sponsors didn't seem in the least impressed. We can remember how many of them said, "Why don't we sit down and take a good hard look at all of AA's 12 steps? Maybe you have been missing a great deal. In fact, perhaps you have been missing just about everything." This was the point at which we began to take our own inventories and not the other fellows. As we got into the swing of self-examination, we began to discover what our real responsibilities toward ourselves and toward those about us actually were. At first, this was a mighty tough assignment, but it did by degrees get easier. Next, we commenced to make restitution to those we had harmed, grudgingly at first, then more willingly. Little by little, it got through to us that genuine progress, spiritual or material, consisted in finding out what our responsibilities actually were, then proceeding to do something about them. Gradually, these activities began to pay off. We found we didn't always have to be driven by pain and discontent. Much more willingly, we picked up the burdens of living and of growing. Then, surprisingly, we began to discover that full acceptance of any clear-cut responsibility nearly always made for true happiness and peace of mind. Moreover, these durable satisfactions were often redoubled when we realized that our now better quality of willingness made it possible in meditation to find and to do God's will. At last, we joyfully knew that at least most of the time, we really wanted a life of willing responsibility. Such was the course of our spiritual unfoldment, our pilgrim's progress, if you like. As it has been with each of us, so has it been with each group and with AA as a whole. For example, I have seen our society timid and fearful, angry and prideful, apathetic and indifferent. But just as often, I have seen these negatives fade as the lessons of group experience were at last learned and applied. Let me recall some instances of this. In AA's early day, we were so timid we felt we ought to be a real secret society. We shunned publicity because we still labored under the stigma of alcohol. Also because we thought that publicity might overwhelm us by an influx, now mark this, of so-called undesirable people. When angered by criticism from within or without, we most often found ourselves far better at dishing out our own punches and taking the other fellows. Sometimes we did boast that AA is the know-all and do-all of alcoholism, thus alienating our friends. Shuddering at the awful perils of group wealth, we often did convert this fear into a marvelous alibi for failing to meet our trivial service expenses. And this despite the fact that these vital activities were indispensable to carrying AA's message into the world about us. Sometimes, by poor sponsorship or none at all, we did fail the needs of newly arrived sufferers. Then, at great turning points in AA history, our fellowship has, in anger or sheer indifference, at first backed away from what should have been clean-cut responsibilities. On a few occasions, disastrous results were barely avoided A few very old-timers can still recall the book Alcoholics Anonymous might never have been published because some in those days avowed we did not need it, while others shrunk from the hazards of preparing that absolutely essential text. 10 years later, we made a great outcry, some of us, against the formation of the General Service Conference of AA, that always needed body of delegates which permanently links our society with its trustees and our active world services. For several years, we had held a belief that no such linkage could possibly be created. Many thought that any attempt at such a project would ruin us. It was commonly believed that we didn't even have sense to run a clubhouse. In consequence, this crucial undertaking nearly fell by the wayside from the sheer weight of indifference, or maybe heavy attack, and little faith. Nevertheless, in God's good time, our spiritual assets did come to well exceed even these most serious liabilities. Today, recovery goes forward on a vast scale. The practice of the 12 traditions has amazingly cemented our unity. Our intergroup associations and World Service Conference have made possible a widespread dissemination of our message at home and abroad. Each time, it has been the same story. Our pains and our necessities have at first called us to a reluctant responsibility. But in these later years, it is simply great to report that willingness and confident faith have more and more permeated our whole society. Despite so much happy transcendence of the difficulties of yesterday, we do nevertheless deeply realize that our negative traits are still very much with us and always will be. Hence, our great and our continuous responsibility should be that of taking repeated, fearless inventories of our defects as we go along, the better to undertake their mending. Therefore, here at Toronto, we are constantly asking ourselves, what sort of heritage are we now leaving to all those generations of AA that will in the future people our society? Is the legacy that we shall bequeath them as good as we can possibly make it? While there is yet time, what can we still do that may multiply our assets and decrease our liabilities? Now, when I try to make such a survey of our society today, I hope none will regard me as one who presumes himself the righteous elder who would admonish or exhort his followers. As I now inventories AA's shortcomings, please be assured that I too am taking my own. Well do I know that my errors of yesterday have left their marks, still have their effect, that my shortcomings of today and of tomorrow could likewise compromise AA's future. So then let us together take a hard look at the more important areas in the life of our fellowship where the challenge for improvement will always be with us. Our first concern should be for those sufferers of alcoholism that we are still unable to reach. Let us humbly recollect that throughout the world today, there are some 20 million alcoholics, 5 million situated in the United States alone. These unbelievable numbers are, of course, in all stages of the sickness. Some cannot be reached because they are not ill enough. Others because they are already hurt too much. Many suffer mental and emotional complications that seem to foreclose their recovery chances. However, it would, I think, be conservative to estimate that at any particular time there are perhaps 4 million alcoholics throughout the world who are able, ready, and willing to get well, if only they knew how. Clearly, all these sick people need to know what their malady is, then to recognize that they are so afflicted. Being so made ready, they then need to be brought within our reach, or indeed within the reach of any other agency of rehabilitation. And this by every resource of public information and word of mouth that can tell them exactly what steps they may take to find their road to recovery. When we remember that in 30 years of AA existence, we have reached but a small fraction of those 4 million we might have been able to help at any time, we commence to get an idea of the immensity of our future task and of the vast responsibility with which we shall always be charged. These arresting facts point straight to our next responsibility, a loving sponsorship of each